Happy Monday. Hope you had a great weekend and are looking forward to this week's test. On Tuesday, I'll reveal to you the company we're going to use as the marketer for this new test that's coming up end of the week. But let's start with talking about pricing today. Pricing is one of those areas where we don't spend a lot of time on it in marketing, even though it's a very key P. Now, what I want you to think about is, with regards to your project, and the product or service that you're planning on bringing out, how are you going to price it? What are the circumstances that go into determining what price you're going to charge for that item? And the first thing I ask you to think about, you should have tested already, and that is, what's your value proposition? What is it that makes you worth buying in the minds of a customer? So you should have tested that out in your questionnaire when you ask customers, how much would you be willing to pay for this item? And hopefully, once you got that, you were able to go back and do some cost work and find that value exceeds the cost of the item you're producing. Now what you want to do is set your price between what it costs you and what the consumer thinks the value is. Consumers will only buy if the value exceeds the price. So that value proposition you have, whether you're better, faster, cheaper, now you've got to quantify that in some way, shape, or form. So the first thing you want to think about is, how elastic is the demand for that product or service? Well, the more of an option it is, the more it is a want rather than a need, the more elastic the price is going to be. So you're going to have to be careful, because changes in price, as you know, will have a change in the demand pattern. You also want to take a look at the value in use. As the customer uses this, will they see the value prop that you've shown them, and do they value it at the rate that your testing thought that it would, or that you've hypothesized it is? Now, you should have tested it, so don't go straight on a hypothesis. So now you've got you figured out that it costs you, let's say, $10 for the item. Customers are valuing it at $25, and because you're selling it at a keystone margin, you're going to price it at 20. And you're probably saying, how did you get the 20? Well, remember, if you know the cost and you know the markup, you can figure the price, because price is equal to your cost divided by 1 minus the markup percent. Okay, so let me repeat that. Price is equal to your cost divided by 1 minus the markup percent, or in this case, 10 divided by 1 minus 0.5, which is equal to 0.5. So you've got 10 divided by 0.5, and 10 is half of 20. There you go. You also want to make sure that you can break even, because keep in mind, that cost price is strictly your variable cost. It's not the fixed cost that you've got to worry about. So the fixed cost is going to include, what is your marketing going to cost? Well, that brings us back to, how do you get people through the funnel again? So now you've got to think about, what do I have to spend to get a customer? And that's why we always talk about things like cost of customer acquisition. Now, we really haven't looked at that in this course, but you should think about that. What does it cost you, with all the marketing spending you have to do, to move a customer from a target market to a paying customer? And all the costs that you spent on, if it's 100 people you have to talk to up here to get one, all the costs that you spent starting with those 100 get put on that one customer. So let's say your break even is 100,000 for, or not your break even, your fixed costs, sorry. Your fixed costs are 100,000 for this particular product. So you've got fixed costs of 100, variable costs of 10, and a price of 20. Well, that tells you your break even in units is 10,000, because the break even calculation to calculate it in units is break even is equal to fixed costs divided by price minus variable cost, or 100,000 divided by 20 minus 10, 100,000 divided by 10, 10,000. You need to figure that one out too, and make sure both your cost calculation and your break-even calculation are included with your marketing plan. Now you got to think about pricing objectives. So you have to think about what's your strategy for getting into the market. So here we come into the go-to-market strategy that you're being graded on as part of the project. Well, if your go-to-market strategy is you're trying to capture as much share as fast as possible, then you probably want to use a penetration pricing model. So in this case, you might not want to use that keystone of 50%. You may only want to charge 25%, which now means that your sell price is going to be 15. Now, the problem with that is now your break even has jumped to 20,000 units. Okay? So I'm going to leave you to do the calculations, and here's what I want you to do. Send me the information for how I calculated those numbers. Okay? So if we drop our price, so we only have a 25% markup, we now need to sell 50 or 20,000 units. Send me the math to prove that. All right? And I'll give you a bonus mark for that. Okay. That's penetration pricing. Usually use penetration pricing when it's really important to capture market share. So if you ever see something like a green field, or somebody describes something as a land rush in marketing, that's where you want to go out, capture as much share as possible, and then what you plan on doing is holding it. You know others are going to take it as more competition comes in, but you also know from your research it's a highly price-sensitive market. The opposite way you can do it is more of a skimming strategy. Now, in a skimming strategy, what you're going to do is you're going to charge a higher price. Now, why are you going to charge a higher price? Well, remember we said that up front, the value consumers were placing on that product was $30. They thought they would be willing to pay up to $30. At that point, there's a break. What you set the price at was $20 to give a big split, so you were providing a big value to them, which is a great way to get them in. Now, let's say instead you're going after those early innovators, the people who have the biggest pain and are willing to pay almost anything to get the product. In that case, a skimming strategy will work. And in a skimming strategy, you might not want to do 50% margin. Let's say you do a 90% margin. Now, your sell price goes from what? Well, it goes from 20 to 100. And your break-even point now goes to what? Send me the answers to those questions. Again, another bonus mark. Want to see if you understand the math behind it. Skimming really works when you've got easily identifiable strata in the market. So you can easily identify that that innovator early adopter maturity. And usually you use it very early on for the innovators and early adopters. It's a very effective strategy. You see it used in electronics all the time. It's used in pharmaceuticals, usually used in cases where you've got a very high fixed cost and you want to recoup that up front so you have very high margins, or where there's not a lot of substitutes. So if you don't have a lot of substitutes, you can charge a much, much higher price point. Another way you get it is if you're protected by some sort of intellectual property or by some sort of regulatory piece. So if you're protected by a patent, which means you're the only person who can produce something that way, you can charge an exceedingly high price and skim the market. Or if you've got a regulatory piece that other companies have to jump through, you can charge high prices. And we've seen that especially in the pharma industry. Okay, but you have to figure out which one of those two you want to take a look at. The last one you can use is what's called pricing for stability. And basically what you do in pricing for stability is you don't want to rock the boat. Usually you do that in a highly competitive market where people are willing to jump around for price. So it's very elastic demand. So you don't want to be seen outside too big of a zone. The problem with that is that if you don't have your price set differently, people might not perceive the value in what you do better. So generally what we tell companies as marketers is, look, even if you're in a highly competitive market, there's probably about a 15–20% zone where you can increase or decrease price. That will give the better value to the customer and show how good you are as a marketer. If you're doing a service with a high fixed cost, then you get into something like yield management. And what I've done is I've attached for you to this particular chapter a video on pricing in the airline industry. My advice is, not my advice, watch it because it'll come back to be one of the questions on the test for sure. Watch it and see the factors that the airline industry takes into account. And you'll notice that they use a variation of everything we've talked about. And that's one important thing to remember is, even though we talk about you can use penetration pricing, you can use skimming, you can use pricing for stability, they're not independent. Actually, they're not mutually exclusive. They're independent. You can use each of them, but because you use one doesn't mean you can't use another one. You'll find that companies will use a variety of pricing systems depending upon the competition, the elasticity of a given product, or a segment of the market they're in. Okay, so keep that part in mind. Consumers, when they're trying to figure out that value, take into account what are called psychological aspects of pricing. Okay, so consumers, for example, whenever they walk into a store, I always put it this way, most consumers walk around with about 200–300 price points in their head of common products they buy. And what they'll do is they'll check your price to that reference price, and if you're out of the zone, outside that 15–20%, you're out of the consideration set. Unless there's something that is truly remarkable you're communicating to them. So always remember, consumers walk in with reference prices. So when you're sending a message out to consumers about why they want to buy your product, make sure that you account for that reference price the customer is thinking of. The next thing that customers always look at is price and perceived quality. In the absence of other information, customers always assume something that's higher price is higher quality. So you can use that to your advantage. You might not be using the most quality product or the most quality components to build your product, but by charging a premium price, consumers may think that you're selling a much higher quality good than you actually are. Now, what you have to make sure is maybe your good quality isn't there, but there's something else it's doing, because if they soon find a disconnect, they're highly unlikely to rebuy your product or service. And then the last piece is not just reference prices, but psychological price points. And psychological price points are, you see them all the time. We always price things at $1.99. And the reason why, for whatever reason, consumers think that $1.99 is much, much less than $2. We see that in gas. Gas is always priced at, currently in Grand Forks, gas is $2.64 and 0.9 cents. Essentially, it's $2.65 a gallon. But by having that 0.9 cents, people go, oh, it's $2.64. It's not $2.65, it's $2.64, because that's what they see first. So you need to realize what those, sorry about the pounding if you hear it, I'm not quite sure what my neighbors are up to. So if I'm looking up, it's because my neighbors, I think, are, I don't know, attempting to build a small thermonuclear device or something upstairs. Anyways, back to psychological pricing, or the psychological price points. Take into account those psychological price points. Where do people say, look, I'm not going to spend above this? Usually it's the ending in 99. That's true if it's $1.99, $199, $19.99 as in $1,999. Or you even see that in the houses now, where a house is priced at $104,900. Well, why don't you just say $105,000, because at that kind of rate, the $100 is next to nothing because it's a huge psychological price. Also take into account what consumers are used to paying. If they haven't paid that much before, that becomes a price point they look at. Take into account your industry conditions. If you've got a fairly stable industry, your pricing can be on the high end. You can use more of the skimming. But if you've got a lot of new entrants, you're probably going to be looking at a penetration pricing, because everybody's going to try and push the price down. If you're selling into a channel, you have to consider the power of your buyers. Walmart, for example, is a great case of where the buyer has the power, and they're really good at pushing their suppliers to lower the price. Because what Walmart will say is, look, you, Mr. Supplier and Ms. Supplier, looking for X% return. You can get X% return by selling Y number of units, or you can sell 120% of Y and make the same profit, but your price point has to be 0.9x. And they do that consistently, because keep in mind, the way Walmart works is based on volume. So they work on very narrow margins, but they turn the merchandise quite frequently, and they make their money through those inventory turns. If you can do that, then you can lower your price as well. The one thing you want to avoid is setting up a low price if you don't have the cost structure to match it. So if your cost structure will allow you to drop your price and sell more units without having a material impact on your profit or even improving your profit, do it. But if selling more units is going to have a problem on your cost structure, or create a problem with your cost structure, then what you want to do is avoid it at all costs. Okay? Last but not least is take account of substitutes. The more substitutes there are for your product, not just direct substitutes, but just the way consumers do whatever it is that you're helping them work on, then what you want to work on is keeping your price low. More substitutes means more elasticity of demand, which means you have to be much more aggressive on your pricing. Fewer substitutes means you can charge a higher price. Now think about that. Who uses the skimming strategy? Well, guys that are coming out with new technology where they're the only ones. But if you go deeper into the market, so if you're going into a more mature market, you probably want to look at more of a penetration pricing model, because what you're trying to do is capture share from everybody else, provided cost structure matches. All right. The last thing we want to talk about is the ethics of pricing. Now, your textbook talks all about gray marketing and black market and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, discounts, yeah, that's great. The only thing I'm going to say about this is whenever you raise a price, the consumers have to see it as a fair raise. They can't see it as something that's strictly a cash grab. So if you're going to raise prices, make sure you communicate to the consumer the reason why prices are going up. Okay? You can talk about your raw materials going up. You can talk about the cost of labor going up. Whatever it is, you just have to make sure you communicate that. And that's where your owned media and your content marketing really come into play. You have to be able to justify that price increase. All right, that's it on prices. Keep in mind, I need you to send me that information on those two pricing examples I gave you, how I got the price point, how I got the break even in units for those two different margin rates. Okay? You work on that, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye for now.